Hi everyone, I'm Janelle Maloney. I edited and annotated Martha Nash's poetry from the Asylum in St. Peter, Minnesota, and put together a genealogical history of her story and its incredible medical backstory, medical case study, cracking the case for perhaps what drove her insane. Poems from the Asylum came out in 2021 and is available at major retailers and at museum gift shops right now for you. So I wanted to tell you what's happening in this video before we continue on. I had the privilege of being able to interview a few of the other Hall Avenue historians for the various families who lived on the same street or in the same neighborhood as Martha Nasch, from as early as pre-1900 all the way up into the 1940s. And so we share a little bit about our family history research, not necessarily all about Martha, but just things that we found looking into our family trees and to our genealogies, as well as something that we would consider and perhaps would encourage others to think about when digging into the past, into their history, and how do we responsibly preserve our stories, even our personal lives? How do we contribute towards a correct, responsible perception of who we are to the next generation, and how do we preserve that in a way that is accessible to future generations, which is something we really have to be thinking ahead of the game to accomplish.
So I would like for Marianne Johnson, would you please introduce yourself to the group?
Well, hi everyone, I'm Marianne Johnson. So glad to meet all of you finally. I see all the messages we're sending. I don't know what we're going to be doing in this group, but I know it will probably be productive because we all are interested in our ancestors' histories and learning about them. So I'm just looking forward to doing more of that.
Mm-hmm. And Marianne Johnson, which family in Hall Avenue do you link to?
My grandmother and grandfather were Joe and Edna Claus, living next door to Louis and Martha Nash.
See, that's something new for me too. His name's Louis, but I love that you're calling him Louis.
I called him Louis. That's why I just read it, and it's Louis. Okay.
That's okay. We have somebody in with Deb and someone else. They're actual cousins, and they can't decide on how to pronounce their own name. Throw you under the bus.
I know the way it's pronounced.
And also, Janelle, I heard the way my mother pronounced things, like Jody told me when I first met her, I wasn't saying the names right either, but I just remember what my mother would talk about, which I never paid attention to, and now I'm very interested in it.
Yeah, and you just don't second guess the way it's been or the way they told you that's how it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Melody, I'm hoping you can clarify the name pronunciation for your family as well. Go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us how you're connected to Hall Avenue.
Hi, I'm Melody Beckman, currently live in Illinois. My great-grandfather was Edward Volkmeyer, and his daughter was Esther Holkgren, and they lived on the corner of Hall Avenue and Elizabeth Street, I guess is what that was there. So, and they were in West St. Paul from about 1880 on. They didn't build the house there on Hall and Elizabeth and didn't finish it until about 1903, but they were in that neighborhood for quite a while.
Your family has the really cool home build story. I don't know if yours was one of the very few, if not only, 2 stories on the street in this microculture.
It could be, and my great-grandfather actually owned a lot of houses in the neighborhood. So the house where John, his son, lived, he actually owned that house, and I think he rented other homes in the neighborhood. I found some old ledgers of his, but that was built as a 1-story to start, and they had a honeymoon cottage that was on the hill on the other side of Elizabeth, and when the first story was finished, they took log big logs, and they pushed the honeymoon cottage down onto the house, and it became the first room on the second floor, and actually was an apartment for pretty much the entire duration of the time that the house was there.
So did they rent out that second story after Grandpa Edward passed, or was that current in the 1920s and 30s?
I think William, who was the second son, actually lived in that apartment when his dad was still alive, my great-grandfather. And then when he moved on, not died, but moved away from the area, then my grandparents started renting that out. As a kid, even my mom growing up, that room was always rented out. It had a little kitchen. I mean, it was the cabin, so it had its own kitchen. The only thing it didn't have was a bathroom. I'm guessing at that time it probably had an outhouse on the hill. And then that hill there, and their Holgren sold the dirt to the city for fill. So that hill is no longer there. There's a house there now, but that land was a high hill. So there's some really good neighborhood shenanigan stories about that hill, but it was there until, my mom and her sister were probably in elementary school, so mid to late 30s.
We've got a little bit of a story of someone in our family who kept renters in her upstairs home. But I think Deb's the best person to tell that story. It kind of goes along with how Carl Holgren went to the asylum after his wife disappeared, after his wife's passing. It's a little mysterious. It's a little confusing, but we got one of those in our family. Mom, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Jody. I'm the mother of Janelle and granddaughter Martha.
That was easy.
That was brief.
Hey, Deb, go ahead, your turn.
My name is Debbie. I am 65. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, basically. And I am the granddaughter of Charles Weiner and Eva. And it's pronounced Weiner, not Weiner. And I can tell you, let me tell you this, because I had to dig around to find this, but I found one of these things where, your mother writes down her history. And I was reading through it, but she wrote in here, and I think she did this like in 1988. She died in 2003, I think, give or take. And, the question, they asked different questions, and the question was, do you remember any names or rhymes about your early years? And she said, I will never forget that they called me Wiener Backhouse Cleaner. So I'm guessing that's the way they pronounced it.
Wait, bathhouse cleaner?
Back, B-A-C-K.
The outhouse, it must be.
Oh, okay.
Well, anyway, that's how I always pronounce the name, just based on what my mother always said. So Weiner might have been, more of a German way of saying it. So I don't know, whatever.
What was your mother's name, Deb?
My mother was Arlene Kammer, but she was child of Eva and Charles. So Charles was born from Charles Weiner and Teresa Doller, but they lived at 637 Hall.
637 and 639. What I noticed is that it's either 637 or 639, but the street addresses don't line up. Like, they don't go in numerical order. And I think that's because one of them existed first, and then the second was the add-on. And so they're like, all the numbers go up in order, except that one is out of order, which I think is funny.
Well, here she had written here, it says, where did your parents first live? And she said, my father was 22, my mother was 20. And they lived at the top of the hill on 637 Hall Avenue.
Oh, top of the hill would be the back of the property.
It was a big, old, tall house on top of the hill at 637 Hall Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, because the pictures show a house down right at the sidewalk level. So they would have been up. I don't know if they had like a back sidewalk that they went around to the back
Yeah.
of it. Go ahead, introduce yourself, Marianne.
Yes, Marianne. Marianne Lancette Palumbo, and I am the niece of Marie Lancette, who married Ralph Nash, Martha's son. And I lived at 620 Livingston. So Elizabeth Street, if you followed Elizabeth Street going east, you would literally run into our driveway. Literally, that's where it ended, and then you go right into our driveway. So about a block from Humboldt, and I was a St. Matthew's girl. So I lived, a lot of my friends on Hall Avenue, so I know it well. I know that whole area well.
You
I didn't
remember
realize
the,
it was easy to access because I know in my head I see Humboldt blocking everything. But if you had just gone up above Humboldt, you can follow Elizabeth straight through.
Correct. Yeah. It was like it came to a T, and then there was these houses, and to get Elizabeth again, you had to kind of walk around, or you could follow a footpath to get to Hall Avenue. Because when Elizabeth hit Humboldt, there was no street that really went through. There was like an alley or a walkway, but not a what I call a drivable street.
Well, now that we're all introduced, I guess I should introduce myself. I am Janelle Maloney. I am Grandpa Ralph's granddaughter. So Martha is my great grandmother, Louis is my great grandfather, and I put together the book Poems from the Asylum. And we have an article currently in review with the Ramsey County Historical Society, which links us all together. So each one of you I've been working with to collect some pretty concrete miniature stories to include in that, including photos and such. And so they now have it in review. And if they ever see little bits and pieces of this video, they'll be so excited because it's a bit of a time capsule. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really honored that you are here, and just kind of feels great to be in the fellowship of other historians, and particularly female historians. So that's something that I would like there to be more of eventually in the future. So I would like to ask everyone in their experience as a female historian or the historian for your family, what is the most surprising thing that you have found in your research? So we've all heard about Martha and her stuff, but maybe there's something else in your repertoire. Maybe Deb can talk about the men in the attic.
oh, that was Maudie.
Oh, well, I want to hear about that anyways.
Well, I didn't know too much about Maudie and the men that were dying. That was the other woman that talked to Cindy. She was the one that said that the men came to her house and died. I didn't know that. I knew Maudie was kind of a crazy woman, but she would have been. She was a sibling to Charles Wiener Jr. I guess in my other side of the family, my Scandinavian side of the family, there were many stories there, some of which I think probably were lies or extrapolations about whose child was who and who got run out of town and things like that. But I don't know too many other secrets in the Wiener family.
So what is the story that popped into your mind to share?
About my Scandinavian side of the family?
Sure.
Well, this goes back, I'm going to see if I can pull this up like 5 generations back. And this was in Denmark in a little island called Norseland. And I've been there and I walked through that area, and it was just kind of, I don't mean to say it was chilling, but I was like, I'm walking in the very same dirt that my great grandfather walked on. But anyway, his wife, the mother of his wife, was the illegitimate daughter of the woman who was run out of town as a prostitute.
Ooh.
I jokingly refer to her as the whore of Denmark, but that's probably, I wouldn't want to go on record as saying that. But
that's going to be our next story.
Yeah. But it's interesting because when you look at the family tree, and this is not the Wiener family, this is the other side of the family. Anyway, in that family, then there were 2 illegitimate generations. This would have been oh gosh, I don't know, probably 1860s. Always said this was such a skeleton in the closet. You know, I don't really care, but it's kind of interesting that there's different takes on what someone considers to be, you know, suitable history and what isn't. So.
You make me think, one of the things I found in researching my husband's family, they went on an Oregon Trail adventure, and there was a maid or a lady's maid or helper that was attending to his great-great-great-grandmother. And we have photographs of her, so we know what she looks like, we know her name. And along the way, she got sick regularly. In the diary, she gets sick every month or, you know, frequently. And then suddenly she has to stop 6 months into the trip from Iowa to California and get married. And she marries some poor Mormon dude, like suddenly in Utah, like can't continue the trip and has to get married. And then her baby is born 4 months later. And so we have been able to track down the that family and the baby, and that baby is documented as being born within wedlock, a year off in all the records. But I'm like, no. I know this woman. I've seen pictures of her from her family trees, and I've seen the pictures from with the great grandmother's story.
Yeah.
It's unmistakably her. And this super duper not your daddy, you know, like I know. Someone asked me, they're like, are you going to tell this family that their family tree's wrong? And I said, no, what's the point?
You just put the facts out there, you know. And you know, I have found that true too when you're recording things, and you'll find discrepancies of several years. You know, they'll say, oh, they were born in 1850, and someone else will say, no, they were born in 1852, and you just kind of gotta roll with the punches on that. One of the other things that kind of fascinated me, in this was my Scandinavian side of the family, is how many children those people had. And the one woman, the descendant of the woman that got run out of town, she had 17 children.
Wow.
6 of whom died in not childbirth, but you know, in that first year. And what was interesting to me, and this is weird, was that they ran out of names. So they started naming the next kid, maybe had the name of the kid that died because they couldn't come up with a new name. I mean, just some of that stuff is kind of interesting to me. But can you imagine having 17 pregnancies and losing 6 of them?
That's some fertility there on your end. Whoa. Yeah, we don't know what happened with Martha, why she couldn't have any other kids. We know she wanted them. She talked about it a little bit in her poetry, but we suspect there may have been some others, but never confirmed and never spoken of. So we can't confirm it, but darn it, I really do think there were some other babies involved, and I don't know. We could be on team one way or the other at that point. Melody, do you have any cool things that you found cool or surprising?
Well, my great grandfather Holgren was a surprise because he was the one that I couldn't trace anywhere. So there had been some talk about a mental institution possibly, but until you contacted me, that was kind of a lost piece on the Scandinavian side. And they were first generation from Sweden. So there isn't anything before that to track. And they had 11 children. So that must have been a really well kept secret. I remember those aunts and uncles, and my great grandfather would have been 16 when my mom died, and she didn't know he existed. I think basically it was my mom was told that he had died before she was born. So, and his wife died in 28. He went to St. Peter's in 1934, and my mom was born in 1932. So that whole thing is, and they lived in the neighborhood, and so did his children. So I just find that it was really odd. And there's only one picture that exists of him. There's just nothing else. My grandmother, who was just his daughter-in-law, kept great notes about her own family, but that side of the family is completely missing. But the other thing I thought was interesting was my grandmother's mother there was 20 years difference between their first son and my grandmother, which is a lot because there weren't a lot of children. There was one child lost in there, but there weren't a lot of children. But my great grandmother was 36 when my grandmother was born, which at that time was old.
Yeah.
And then my grandmother didn't have children, my mom and my aunt, until she was 36. So I thought that was really interesting. So even for my grandmother in 1932 being 36, that was very geriatric to be having children. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
What was her name who was born in 1932?
Gloria.
Oh, Gloria, okay.
Yeah.
So-
So mom is 89. My mom was born in 1932.
Yeah, so Gloria has said that she hung out with or played with at least maybe some of the wiener, I don't know.
Well,
Those kids.
Those kids, yeah. And the house numbers you were talking about, Janelle,
Mhm.
there was a lot of extra land in that neighborhood. So like my great grandfather owned 4 lots. So some of that house numbering had to do with the fact that those lots belonged to a house and then were later sold off. So the numbers are weird because there was land in between that wasn't supposed to be divided for homes, and then it had to be later. So
well, this is what I have here, in this thing my mother wrote, that they lived in the big old house at 637 Hall. And that the in-laws, so Charles's parents, lived next door at 639. And that they had, she said here that in the summer, they would fill a cistern of water from the upper house so that they had water that then they would boil and cook with. They didn't have running water in the house. And then of course they had an outhouse, but that's possibly where the water may have come from your grandfather's land or something like that.
there was a cistern at 624 for a long time too. It still
Yeah.
is in the basement of that house. So that
Really?
was where they got the water. The evolution of that house, because it went from having a coal chute on the house, and then when they moved to the oil furnace, then that, they changed the structure of the basement to put that in, and then they eventually upgraded it to gas. So it's kind of interesting. You don't have a lot of houses that have stayed in the family since the time they were built. And all the history of the house was in the house when I was going through it. So
Marianne Palumbo, what did you think about something surprising you found in your family research?
Well, our great-great-grandmother, Adele Paul Thoreau, had 16 children, and only one died shortly after birth. And there was one son, Peter, and I mean, this story is crazy as you do the research. He married, he had some children, he had a livery stable. It burned to the ground. Somewhere his wife and one of his children dies. He takes up with a 16-year-old, Albertine Durand, and they always identify as man and wife, but we can't find any documentation of a marriage. And Peter gets heavily into drinking and gambling, and he has children with Albertine. But then we find out that Albertine, when she was 15, her parents were going to send her to reform school. So she married an 80-year-old man who rented from her parents.
Oh, wow.
And so when she was with Peter, she was really married to this very old guy.
Oh.
And Peter goes in and out of prison, unfortunately. And he's begging her to write the warden to get him out, but she writes a letter to keep him in. And we have actually a copy of that letter. And I mean, it's just crazy. And finally the old man, he finds her and he's trying to divorce her. And now there's a whole article in the newspaper on it, but she's telling the county that she's trying to get a divorce from Peter. And so she wanted money from the county. But they're finding, and it says in the county, they can't find any legitimate marriage ever of Peter and Albertine. But what she was really trying to do was get a divorce from this older guy, because now Peter's in prison and she's got another guy she's interested in, who she does marry, but for a short period of time. She divorces him, and then she's back with Peter the rest of his life. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, and I kept saying, no, no, no. But then you could find, we went to the county, or we went down to the historical society, so we were able to find his prison records. And I mean, it is a wild story. I mean, someone could really make a good movie of this. But I feel kind of sorry for Peter. I mean, I think Peter, when he lost his wife and his business burnt to the ground, because I know Grandma always said he was a very responsible man. But everything just started, he got into alcohol, which is, very common, not only amongst my family, but I think amongst many of the families. I even think of when he lived on Livingston. Yeah, even in the, even in the German side of the family, all those, there was alcoholism was horrible, and it really affected families. So, no, and I'm still trying to track Peter and his saga. Now it's to find more documentation on Albertine, but she was quite the woman. I don't know whether to admire her or wonder if she was insane. But Peter wound up in St. Peter's too, in the insane asylum. But his came from having syphilis, and it was right before penicillin came out. But he lived to be quite old, so I'm not sure what happened in there. If once penicillin came out, he must have maybe been treated, if that helped. But I still think the syphilis had affected his brain. But he also had other brothers who contacted syphilis, so that's just a fascinating story to me. Without trying to judge any of them, I think syphilis, believe it or not, was pretty common, not just among the Tyrol, but amongst many men at that time. We cannot find a death on his first wife. All I know is he showed up in court, again, writing bad checks because he said Albertine didn't pay the bills when he gave her the money. So he was writing bad checks, but it says that he had a wife who had passed away and a child, and that's what changed his course in life. But because she probably died before 1900, it's hard to find death records before 1900. You can find some, but it's a little more difficult. But I still would love to know exactly when she died. Did she die for sure? Was that just another story? I mean, I know she existed, but I can't find that she passed away, other than that one newspaper article, which, when you think about the timeline, was accurate.
That's a little twisted tale there. Marianne, can you tell us a little bit about the alcoholism in the Claus family and what was going on upstairs?
Oh, yeah, that's the moonshine. So my grandpa, I guess, had a still in the upstairs on Hall Avenue there. And my grandma Edna, the reason I know that she was upset about it is because her son, my Uncle Joe, he was telling his son, how she was crying and wanted him to get that still out of the house. Well, he was kind of wacko anyhow, but he had the still, and I guess the feds busted the house, and they went upstairs and they tipped that mash pot over, and it was all over everything, and my grandma was crying. And yeah, see, I wouldn't know that, but my Uncle Joe, who was living at the house, he was telling his son this, and he kind of hated my grandpa because they blamed him for my grandma's death, because he was always giving her this abortion medicine and making her ill all the time. And so finally they kicked him out of the house. But that was one of the things that happened, while he was there. And I guess he was a pretty mean, angry character. But that's when I first met Jody. I was telling her about that anti-German, sentiment that was back then, because they hated the Germans because America was at war with Germany, and the teachers in school couldn't speak the language or teach it. And it was just a terrible time. And I thought maybe, you know, here I'm making excuses for my grandpa. That's typical in alcoholic families, you know, make an excuse for him. But I was thinking that, you know, they came to this country, you know, and then being hated by the country that they came, you know, to have a better life in, and that must have felt awful. And I think that was a lot of his anger might have been about that, but it doesn't excuse his behavior and all the things, you know, or yeah, he was quite the character.
That's a lot all in one package. And then he ended up at St. Peter's 3 times that we know of.
3 times, and the record says for violent temper. I don't have his records from there, but his son Leo, my uncle Leo, he ended up going to San Quentin prison and also St. Cloud prison. And I got the records from San Quentin, and it said in there that his father had been put in St. Peter for a violent temper.
One thing to look for when you find that is see if he's listed as a patient or an inmate. That made all the difference in our research that we were looking at with Melody's family, and she just stepped out, is that so if I back up really quick, her mom's Gloria, then Esther, and Esther's married to John. John's dad disappeared right after his wife died and then was good for dead. They had no idea. But he went in and he was enrolled as an inmate. But Martha went in and was enrolled as a patient. And the docents have confirmed there's a huge difference.
Janelle, did anyone ever explain what the difference was between an inmate and a patient?
They did. They said that they would have had to go to criminal court, and then the court would have determined that they would go in. So either the cops would arrest them, bring them to the court, and the cops would say this person is too dangerous, and then follow through, or somehow in that process they would get them out of jail once they were already in jail because of being too violent or unable to be managed.
Okay, so that was an inmate then, correct? So that was an inmate.
Yeah, so they had to actually have done some kind of crime first.
Or they could
Because that was
be,
Peter, so that explains.
they could be committed also and be an inmate.
Yeah, Melody, you said somebody in the family was actually paying for Carl to keep him there or to keep his room and board or something like that.
Right. So my daughter's a forensic psychiatrist. So that's what she deals with, is prisons and inmates and committed. But if the court commits somebody, which is the case in my great-grandfather, then he does not have the freedom to leave that establishment. And so he's considered an inmate also because he can't walk out. So his daughter, some of the records that showed up, his daughter was actually paying the $10 a month fee to have him there and was appointed as his guardian. But because the court appointed him to be there and he couldn't leave on his own, then he was considered an inmate.
Jody, do you have something you want to share before we go to our next question?
No, I have so many things. Like some of you've said, I love the scandals. I love the gossip and I love the scandals. I just like, it's so exciting and so interesting to me. But I was sitting here thinking, you know, I don't think people had any more scandal and gossip. Do you know what I'm saying? Like in 50 years, are my kids and grandkids going to be like, oh my gosh, Grandma Jody said that, Grandma Jody did that. Like, and so it's not like all of a sudden this generation, oh, we're perfect, but still, I think it's just human nature for us to look back at our relatives and go, wait, they did what? Like, what's, you know, so to me, that's so interesting and so compelling. So anytime you want to share a scandal, like share the scandals, because those are fascinating to me. But in terms of the book, I think some of you probably see our comments when we're chatting back and forth. But even for us as researchers, like my dad talked about all my neighbor Art, my cousin Art, and my aunt this and da da da. So it's not like he never talked about it. But I never got, and this is completely to Janelle's credit because she did all the census and the maps and all that. I never knew they were all neighbors. Like and my dad might have said it, but I was a kid, but I don't remember him ever saying, oh, my aunt who lived next door, or my so-and-so. Like, he didn't add the other little piece to it. So I had no idea that he was surrounded by family. That was just eye-opening to me. Then the other big surprise, of course, was finding out how many of our people were committed. That was shocking.
Yeah.
That, you know, we're related, like we're kind of related to the neighbor thing. We've connected through the neighbor thing, and we're all interested in history. But then again, as Janelle dug more and more, and as you guys revealed little pieces of information too, we're like, wait, what do you mean your grandfather? What do you mean? Like, you know, that was just shocking to me. And then we had to kind of go back and forth in our research, and you know, because you can jump to conclusions, and you don't want to be like, oh, there were more mentally ill people back then. No, there's probably more mentally ill people today, frankly. But, you know, that you can't like necessarily make assumptions. You have to know the culture, you have to know the history, you have to know that, you know, they didn't have appropriate, whatever, medication or counseling or therapy, what, you know, all the different things they could choose from. So, you know, they didn't have that. They didn't have those resources. So like knowing the culture and history before you necessarily form an opinion about it, but it was still shocking to me to find out how many of us institutionalized relatives. That's just still wrapping my mind around that. And then just the interesting little factoids you learn. So I was talking to the historian down in Sibley County, 90 years old. This woman, she's a volunteer, but 90 years old. We had a chit chat on Friday. And I don't know how we got on this topic. She was talking about somebody who died or something. And she said, well, you know, furniture makers were the ones that used to embalm people. And I was like, wait, what? Like, was it a mortician? And she says, yeah, because the furniture makers made the coffins and they actually did the embalming. So you would have your relative embalmed at the local furniture store, which again, if you say that nowadays, lazy boy, you can embalm your, you know, I don't want to speak disrespectfully, but let's go down to lazy boy and you know, get grandpa embalmed. You know, so that was crazy. It's like those little factoids are just so exciting and interesting to me that and maybe some of you knew that, but I was like, that's new to me. And then the last little piece of information. So this goes back to those of you that had relatives in St. Peter, or if you talk to other people. So I was talking to the lady in Sibley County, and I said, I still don't understand though, because she mentioned somebody had been buried, and I forget who, someone had been buried at St. Peter. I said, I don't understand though, if, you know, God forbid, you know, your grandma or whoever gets sick and dies there or whatever, something happens. I said, I don't understand, why didn't the family, you know, it's sad, but come get the body and do a Christian burial, do a church burial, what have you. So this is where you guys can kind of laugh, but this is why we need your input being from Arizona. I never thought. She's like, oh, if it's in the dead of winter, you're not going to come down to St. Peter and hold a funeral or have a burial. Like, you can't. The travel and all of that and crazy stuff you guys are going through right now. Like, I don't think snow. So when I'm writing and researching, you need to keep reminding me and go, okay, in Minnesota, we have snow. So she was telling me in certain situations, it wasn't a case of the family didn't, you know, I'll just say grandma, didn't love grandma or didn't want her or didn't want to do a burial. They said travel conditions, the weather, and then the other thing, and I don't want to get too creepy, but I think if you're in this group, you probably have some level of morbid interest. But she said that the facility, St. Peter, would not have the money to embalm people. So when people died, we're going to spend the money to embalm people. So even if I was like, hey, I have to travel from whatever county, maybe across state lines, whatever, to come claim the body, they, for lack of, you know, better way of saying, they can't preserve the body for days on end for you to come collect the person. They would have to bury them immediately. And then I don't, here's another research question. I don't know if people were ever exhumed from that cemetery. That's a whole nother thing. But again, here's my point, because I know Janelle's like, Mom, make your point, make your point, make your point. Not making assumptions, because I was like, what's wrong with these families that they don't want to like come get their grandmother and give her a proper church Christian burial? I could get real judgy until I understand the context and go, oh, there's a reason. Now, could there certainly be people where all their family was gone? Yes. But the more I learn, it's always check. So this is a general statement. Check your assumptions, check your facts, do your research. And then have someone else check it too. To go like, hey, am I thinking about this right? You know, all these people were abandoned. Oh no, you know, it was the dead of winter. So I love talking to these family history nerds because they're so full of information. And I guess so I think I said it was my ending point. I lied, Janelle. Here's my real ending point. Please correct me, if not Janelle. I always want to be corrected. If I say, wait, no, West St. Paul is the same as the west side of, what are you talking about?
We can't have this conversation again.
Yeah, like wait, you're all saying the same thing. And I know you're saying the same thing, so you're wrong. You know, but correct for me, I'm saying correct me. We spelled a cousin's name wrong. I'm mortified. I'm still mortified over that in the book. It was wrong. And maybe we can't fix it now, but going into other stories, other articles, or even just general information, I certainly don't want to be the writer or even speaker. Janelle, I've certainly misspoken in a couple interviews already, but we don't want to on purpose be saying the wrong stuff.
You know, you make a good point about how we get to be active participants in making sure that the historical legacy is preserved in a responsible way. So my next and final question for everyone is, how has this exploration into our family history, and I say our because we're all kind of related through this experience, but how has the exploration made you either think, maybe for the first time, or rethink how you want to leave your family's newest legacy behind for the next generation? Perhaps, as I see Deb's got that book in her hand, you know, where you write your story down, little bits and pieces about your life as a child, things like that, for the next generation, just to capture the story the way you want it remembered, or the details you want remembered. If they're going to Google you now, because our kids will be able to Google us, what do you want them to be able to find on you? And how do you want to make sure you have an input on that situation? So I'm all for those grandma books at this point. Maybe I'll start figuring out how to preserve, like, who was I? Who was I? And even though who am I is correct. So what do you think, before we go tonight, what do you think? What are you going to do about that?
Janelle, I think it's really interesting on how you found me through ancestry.com. That a lot of people forget that it's not just their record. So if I hadn't made my tree public, then you wouldn't have had that opportunity to connect, to try to find the Volkmar site and go to me. And I think it's important we protect our children. And I don't have my children listed on our family tree, but my tree is certainly public. And so those bits and pieces that I have found on my family and tied it to leave breadcrumbs for the next person so that they can build their own paths from there.
It's a great answer, Melody. I love it. Yeah, Marianne, go ahead.
Well, too, I agree with Melody. I've been kind of building a family tree, and then I noticed very few in the family, you know, say, oh, what about this ancestor? But they just aren't that interested. And for a long time, I felt really weird because it was just coming from the heart. I was so into, I want to find Edna. I want to find, you know, about that family. And I would drive over to the west side and, you know, just sit out there sometimes and think about what the stories my mother told me. And, you know, always wish, oh, I wish I could go in that house and just see what it looks like, you know, and that, but I always felt kind of sad because I thought I'm the only one that cares about this stuff. And it made me feel weird. But then when I meet people like you all, it's like, oh, okay, it's normal. It's just some people aren't into it. And there are some that will be the family historian, and others are interested. They want to know about it, but they don't want to do the research. And I have the desire to do the research.
You're right.
Yeah.
There's usually about one per generation, but we have to find who that next person is in our family and encourage them to take a look and encourage them to explore and find the fun, find the treasure in that treasure hunt. So I agree with you. Deb.
You know, one of the things that I have advocated for, because Charles Wiener, my grandfather, who was born in I'm looking at my ancestry here. He was born in 1892 and he suffered severe depression. And when you talk about weird things they used to do, he, they didn't have Prozac in those days. So they pulled his teeth thinking that that was inflammation that was going to come out and that he would no longer be depressed. So you take a depressed person, you pull their teeth. But anyway, he did commit suicide in 1932. And for years they said, oh, he had a brain tumor, it was, blah, blah, blah. Well, then when my younger brother, Dale, who would have been Charles' great-grandson or something like that, when my brother became ill, all of a sudden my mother and grandmother were saying, well, we really think Charles was depressed. It wasn't that brain tumor that killed him. And so I have really felt the need to acknowledge, I don't mean to say own up, but to acknowledge that this is part of my family and that I have 3 siblings who have been, hospitalized for depression. I have a niece who's currently on a leave of absence from her job because of depression. And in so many places, this just is, it's not talked about. And I know when I was working at the hospital, a lot of times people would say, oh, they got all the crazy people up on 5th floor. And I would stop and I'd say, stop right now. You need to know that my sister was a patient up there.
Wow.
So anything you're going to say, temper it with that in mind,
Wow.
So anyway, that's kind of what I have, my energy coming off of the Charles Wiener part.
Definitely, it matters for our kids and our kids' kids to know what's going on, because medical records, as we've found out, especially with those asylum records, they're really hard to get to. And I think I cracked the code because the census records include the patient names. But granted, that's like once in every 10 years. You're just going to get a sliver, but they have all the patients in them. Psst, for historians. Marianne or Jody, what will you do?
Yeah, well, everyone's kind of said it. Marianne, I'm like you. I always feel like the weird one. And why aren't other people that interested? Because to me, it's a personal journey. It tells the story of our family. And I'm very much about talking about mental health and not even trying to stigmatize so many relatives who had alcoholism and did some horrible things, but I didn't have to walk in their shoes. But I think it's so important to put it out there. And then I remember I met Jody and Jody was like, no, I only want to do this. No, I only, but I go, Jody, no, I think I have her hooked. So it was like, no. So, but I am concerned who's going to kind of take this after me. To me, it's just about a journey of a family. And I know that they're all dead, but it is still a part of us. And that's what I hope people take away from it. And sometimes I wrestle with telling some of these stories, about the alcoholism or, finding stories where my own father, got caught trying to steal a safe. Do I put this out there? But to me, it's just a story of their lives. It doesn't come with judgment. It's not meant to shame anybody. It's going to be the generations after us. They're going to have these same things that happened. Why do I need to be ashamed of what somebody did in my past? I don't know what happened to them. Again, I didn't have to walk in their shoes, but I don't know. I just love this. And sometimes I'm afraid people think I'm a crazy person. So I have to kind of temper myself sometimes, but no, so I'm glad to hear it. That was the fun of doing this project with you. For me, traveling back to where I grew up, I could see all of this stuff in my mind. That was just so much fun. I could see the houses. And then when you guys would go the West St. Paul, I go, oh my God, no, we're all ready to pass out. So no, this has been fun. And I'm glad to see that there's, other people are passionate about this. And I can't control what's going to happen after me, but I'm having fun, and I'm just hoping that what I do isn't going to get trashed somewhere. So I've asked my boys, with all the stuff that I did, would you consider, if you don't want it, because I understand you may not be able to keep it, and that's an issue. Sometimes people don't have the ability to keep it. Can you donate it? And I've already told them places to look at that may take it, because it's very detailed. At least send it there. If they say no, I guess we can't, but I'm pretty sure they would take it because it's so detailed and goes back into history. So anyway, That's my thing, is even to think about, if you don't think anybody wants it, what do you want them to do with that? And to make sure it's not just told to somebody, but you even put it in with your paper stuff. You know, please, if something happens to me, check this out. And let's hope that it goes someplace safe.
We've talked about that, especially for Grandma's poems, and I've only had them in my possession for a few years. And in those few years, the color of the page has changed dramatically. So just from me opening up, and now they're in little protective slips, they're in a binder that doesn't let light in, but still, I went through it in this process so many times that I've personally seen them like get older. So it's at this point, it's no, I can't even pass that on. It needs to get to someone who knows what to do with it and who can preserve it. And that means letting go and donating to a museum.
Right. Okay.
Do you have any final thoughts for how to preserve your legacy in a responsible way?
We donated a lot to the Historical Society in Ramsey County. I mean, the house was so old. We had things that were from the beginning of, you know, a lot of original furniture and trunks and diaries and old photos. And knowing that my siblings and my mom didn't care for them, they were so happy to get all that stuff. And I know it'll be on display when they have time. But that's a really good point that you make, Janelle, is to get it to someplace, and donating it in the West St. Paul area seemed to make so much more sense than to take it back home and then figure out what to do with it. So they were really good. They came and got stuff, and I could document it as much as I could from the history that I knew. But they took a large van full from the house, which was nice.
Final thoughts from you?
Well, yeah, I did. I think this past summer, I filled out a couple of those Grandma Remembers books, but now you got me thinking. I mean, it's all those little handwritten books. I'm thinking another project now would be to digitize those. So I probably need to type those things up at some point. Again, you kind of wonder how interested your kids are going to be, but this is a spoiler alert for Janelle. I wrote stuff in there that you can't unsee. So I figure it'll be worth reading. And, you know, after I'm dead, because I was like, you know what? I'm going to give an honest answer. You know, they ask those fluffy questions like, oh, what's your fondest memory? And, you know, so some of and one of the books was pretty, some of the questions were really real personal. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to give an honest answer because that's who I am. And you're going to know me as a real person, like it, love it, leave it, you know, in 25 years, whatever, however long I live. So I kind of took a little bit after Grandpa Lewis that way, where he would just write these very pointed comments about people. And I laugh now. And then you go, it's not going to matter. I'm going to be dead. So I actually would think that as I was writing stuff going, I shouldn't write this. And then I was like, oh, I'm dead. It doesn't matter. I'm dead. So, and then my final thought, I'll keep it brief, but my final thought is, so that's looking forward. What are you going to leave for your kids? But I am still, and again, we welcome your feedback, comments, opinions, good, bad, indifferent about the book. I'm still actually processing the book because I was in researcher brain when I wrote it, researcher brain. And I think most of you saw in our little chat, you know, I called her Martha, like she was a character to me. I mean, obviously she's my grandmother, but to talk about her, it'd be like Martha, like I'm distant from her. But I think now that it's done, I'm still, and I'd love, maybe this is another conversation, to really process her more as a person and to look at her life and see, you know, she was a real person, and how does her life relate to me, or how can I understand her as a woman, or how can I understand her as someone in a challenging, obviously can't relate to an insane asylum, but how can I even understand that, okay, this woman is still me, even though it's hard to get, like she's me. Where did she get the strength to go through what she went through? Am I like that? Am I not like that? Can I be like that? So I don't know if I'm making sense. Maybe Melody, we should bring your daughter on next time and do psychological analysis, but kind of, I'm still processing, how can I connect to her as a person, her story? Am I making sense to you guys? So it's still like thoughts, just the whole.
And that's how I feel with Charles Wiener, the junior. You know, I never really thought of him too much as my grandfather because he died, 60 years before I was born. And my grandmother had remarried. So her second husband was more of whom I thought of as a grandparent. But then for whatever reason, I felt kind of drawn to go to the cemetery and find his headstone. And I sat there a little bit and I thought, so you really are my relative, even though on paper, he was this other person. And then I got to tell you, just this little tiny, this is kind of humorous. When my daughter was in, I don't know, grade school or whatever, they had to do a family tree thing, and the school sent them home with these questions to ask grandparents. And she was interviewing my mother-in-law. And the question was, how many children did you want? And she said, well, I wanted 3, but I got 4.
Whoops.
And my husband would have been the number 4. I just thought that was hilarious.
Oh.
So
Before we go, I wanted to, since Deb didn't touch on it, I wanted to tell the story about Aunt Maudie. So Aunt Maudie is Charles and Teresa, Charles Weiner and Teresa Doerler's
Wiener.
daughter. Weiner, whatever. So the Doerlers is Grandpa Ralph's great grandmother. Anyway, so they're like actually cousins across the street. So Maudie ended up, after her husband died, she ended up having people, older gentlemen, coming to live in her upstairs. I don't know if it was an apartment or just the upstairs part
I think
of
it was
her
just
house.
a bedroom. It was just a bedroom. I don't think it was an apartment.
And she didn't make it like a whole thing. It was like, just, she's got men upstairs, and people would come over to her house and she would tell them, no, you can't go upstairs. They're up there. They're sleeping. They're whatever. And she would keep them off limits, and they were renting from her, but she was also taking care of them somehow. And then they would die. And when that one would die, she would get another one.
See, that was something Cindy talked about. I never heard they died of unusual circumstances. I just knew that there were men that lived there that she, took in and was, I don't know if you'd say, nursing them or, taking care of them in their dotage or whatever. But,
yeah, maybe they were like at the end of their life anyways, or maybe she just helped them along. We don't know. But gosh darn it, I wish we knew. I wish that somebody somewhere had written something down and gotten us clarity, because we do have just this rumor that was passed down, and it's really hard to grab onto, and it's really unbelievable. It's like, what happened to these old men upstairs? Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining me on this Zoom call. It was really an honor. Yes.
Janelle, just quickly, just something people have to think about is I do a lot of my stuff in handwriting. And my grandson was 14, had a project that he had to do about his ancestors. And so I sent him some of the stuff that I had. And he said he can't read it. And I says, well, then I'll send it email, because I was texting it to him. No, you don't understand. I can't read it. Many schools don't teach cursive anymore.
That's true.
I don't. I have totally changed to now doing everything in print, and it's kind of hard, but I believe it's hard enough trying to read the Latin stuff we're trying to read and old transcripts. And if we don't start taking a look at now doing things in print, they may not even be able to decipher what we're doing.
That is such
So that's just
or digitizing, even doing the books. We needed to get it online. So I had at some point a project to get a bunch of stuff on YouTube, because even if I die, that video will live on forever, and be accessible. No one's going to have to go into my filing cabinet. No one's going to have to interpret and decide if it's valuable or important or not. And just getting to that point of the next generation's currency is not written. So how can we preserve these things in a long-term fashion, but without getting them to a digital mass retrievable format? Then we're just kind of stuck in this paper land. So you're right. You're super right. We have to think about how do we keep this stuff relevant in an accessibility way.
That's all up to you.
I did my part for sure. I've got the book. And so now that will continue on through history, perhaps. So, ladies, again, I enjoyed our chat so much. It was really satisfying, and I enjoyed getting to know each and every one of you a little bit more. It makes a big difference to see your face and hear your voice. Melody, you were a delight to hear from. Marianne, oh my gosh, I think this is only the second time we've ever spoken with our voices. So it was really fun to get to hear your story a little bit more. And I hope we can do this again another time. So good night. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank
Good
you.
night. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Again, the book is online and in major book retailers. If you have any questions about the material or the research that's being done, feel free to reach out at my website, janellemaloney.com/contact. You can learn a little bit more about the book project, 7 Years Insane, and of course, Poems from the Asylum. We're also on Facebook at 7 Years Insane, and we would love to connect with you there. Thank you.